When we talk about the Middle Ages, most people picture castles, kings, and knights. But the real medieval world was shaped far more by ordinary villagers and by the beliefs that guided their decisions, their fears, and their hopes. Daily life in a medieval village wasn't governed only by church doctrine or official laws. It was shaped just as deeply by superstitions, folk magic, and centuries-old traditions that blended pagan customs, Christian teachings, and local stories passed down by word of mouth. To understand what medieval villagers believed, we have to step out of the castle and into the fields, forests, and cottages where ordinary people lived. These beliefs didn't come from books. They came from observation, habit, fear of the unknown, and a need to explain a world filled with sickness, unpredictable weather, and many dangers that people couldn't control. For most villagers, the world was alive with unseen forces. Spirits lived in the woods. Witches might cast curses. The dead could influence the living. Natural objects could carry protective power, and everyday actions, like spilling salt, knocking on wood, or sweeping the doorstep, could hold supernatural meaning. These beliefs weren't seen as strange or optional. They were simply part of life, woven into every task and every season. Most medieval Europeans believed the universe was filled with layers of influence. God and the saints were at the highest level, watching over the world. Beneath them were angels, demons, wandering spirits, fairies, ghosts, and other supernatural beings whose existence made sense in a world where explanations were scarce. Villagers didn't separate religion from superstition. They considered both part of the same reality. The church, saints' relics, charms, herbal remedies, and protective rituals all blended together into a single worldview that helped people navigate uncertainty. One of the most important beliefs was that misfortune had a cause, and that cause was rarely random. If a cow died, if a child fell gravely ill, if a crop failed, people didn't assume it happened by chance. Something or someone had caused it. Maybe a malicious neighbor had cast the evil eye. Maybe a wandering spirit had touched the household. Maybe a saint was displeased, or the weather had been cursed, or someone had broken a taboo. The search for causes created a rich tapestry of explanations, most rooted in superstition and folk tradition. Weather alone inspired dozens of beliefs. A sudden storm could be seen as a sign of divine displeasure. Strong winds might be blamed on witches who were believed to control storms. Villagers carried protective charms or made gestures toward the sky when thunder cracked overhead. Rainbows, comets, eclipses, and unusual cloud formations all carried symbolic meanings, often interpreted through a mixture of local superstition and Christian teaching. Animals held deep symbolic power as well. Cats, especially black ones, were associated with witchcraft in later centuries, though early medieval attitudes were more varied. Owls were seen as omens of death. Dogs, howling at night, were believed to sense spirits. A bird tapping on a window could mean a soul was near. Villagers watched the behavior of animals closely because they believed animals could sense what humans couldn't. Plants and herbs also carried supernatural significance. Certain herbs, like St. John's wort, mugwort, vervain, and yarrow, were believed to drive away evil spirits. Garlic protected against sickness. Rosemary could guard a home. Rowan trees were thought to repel witches and were often planted near cottages or stables. These plants weren't just medicinal. They were magical shields in a world where danger often came without warning. Folk magic was part of everyday life, not something rare or hidden. People wore charms around their necks, pinned herbs to their clothing, or hung protective objects above their doors. Mothers placed amulets near infants to keep away malevolent forces. Farmers murmured blessings over seeds before planting. Fishermen made signs of protection before heading out to sea. These practices were viewed not as witchcraft, but as common sense, practical ways to stay safe. The belief in curses was widespread. Villagers feared the evil eye, a look believed to bring harm, especially to children and livestock. Misfortune was often traced back to envy. If a neighbor praised a healthy baby or a strong animal, people sometimes worried that admiration could hide jealousy, and that jealousy could magically cause harm. To counteract this, villagers used protective gestures, words, or charms to undo the negative force. Blessings and counter-curses were equally common. Some villagers knew how to break curses using spoken formulas, symbolic actions, or religious objects. These weren't professional sorcerers, but ordinary community members, healers, wise women, or elders who had learned traditional methods passed down through generations. Their knowledge wasn't written, it lived in memory and practice. Even objects used every day could hold magical meaning. Iron was believed to repel evil, so people hung iron tools near doors or placed horseshoes above entryways. Bread and salt were sacred substances symbolizing life and protection. Coins, bells, carved symbols, and simple knots tied in string could all serve as magical safeguards. But medieval villagers didn't see themselves as practicing magic. They believed they were simply protecting their families in a dangerous world filled with forces beyond human control. They respected the church and participated fully in religious life. At the same time, they trusted the older customs passed down by their parents and grandparents. These older customs made sense in a world where danger felt personal, tangible, and sometimes unpredictable. Understanding these beliefs requires us to view the medieval world through their eyes. They didn't have modern science or reliable medicine. Diseases appeared suddenly and spread rapidly. Weather destroyed crops without warning. Animals fell ill for reasons no one could explain. In such a world, superstition wasn't a weakness. It was a coping mechanism. It gave structure to chaos and offered explanations when nothing else made sense. This worldview wasn't passive or fearful, it was active. Villagers believed they could influence their destiny through rituals, charms, prayers, and careful behavior. Their lives were filled with meaning, where every sound, symbol, and occurrence might contain a message. To understand what medieval villagers believed is to understand their daily world more deeply than any historical document can show. It brings us inside their cottages, their fields, their fears, and their hopes. And in the next parts, we'll explore these beliefs in detail. How people used protective magic, how they understood curses, how they interpreted signs and omens, how they viewed the supernatural world, and how all of these shaped their everyday decisions. When we step into the mindset of a medieval villager, we walk into a world where nothing was ever just random. Every sound, every shadow, every strange moment carried meaning. If a rooster crowed at the wrong hour, people noticed. If a candle guttered in a still room, someone wondered why. If a child woke crying in the night, the question wasn't simply, "What's wrong?" It was, "What caused this?" In their world, invisible forces were everywhere, and the greatest mistake you could make was to ignore them. To us, the medieval world often seems uncertain and mysterious. But to villagers, that uncertainty had patterns. It had rules. It had explanations passed down from parents and grandparents long before written records. Even though Christianity dominated the official culture, everyday villagers lived inside two overlapping belief systems, the religion preached in churches and the older folk beliefs woven into daily life. These two worlds didn't clash, they blended. A villager might pray to a Christian saint for healing, then tie a protective herb pouch around their neck, just in case. They might attend Mass on Sunday, then refuse to take a certain path home because a spirit was believed to wander that road. In their minds, these practices weren't contradictory. They were complementary layers of protection. Let's begin with one of the most powerful ideas medieval villagers believed in. The world was filled with signs. Nature communicated constantly, and humans had to listen. Thunder at midday was a warning of conflict to come. A sudden gust of wind on a calm afternoon meant someone had spoken a lie. The first bird you saw in the morning influenced the luck of your entire day. A magpie could mean mischief, a crow might signal bad news, and if you saw a lone raven circling above a field, you didn't shrug it off. You paid attention. Animals weren't simply animals. They were messengers. Cats sensed spirits. Dogs howled when death was near. Horses could detect witches and refuse to pass certain doorways if something supernatural lingered nearby. Villagers watched their livestock carefully. A cow refusing to produce milk didn't suggest illness first. It suggested interference. Maybe a neighbor with a jealous heart had placed a curse. Maybe a witch had borrowed the cow's milk magically. Or perhaps an unseen spirit had disturbed the barn that night. This wasn't paranoia. It was the framework villagers relied on to explain life's biggest problem: misfortune. When things went wrong, and they often did, someone or something was responsible. A child falling ill, a calf born weak, milk curdling for no reason. None of these were considered natural accidents. Instead, medieval villagers believed in forces of harm that could strike human households. The most common was the evil eye, a dangerous look fueled by envy. If someone admired your child a little too strongly or praised your bread with a tone too sharp, villagers took note. That praise might be genuine, or it might be hiding jealousy. And jealousy, they believed, had real power. It could blight crops, sour beer, or bring sudden sickness to livestock. People weren't always conscious of giving the evil eye. It could slip out unintentionally, but its effects were feared nonetheless. To guard against this, villagers wore amulets, pinned sprigs of protective herbs to children's clothing, or muttered counter-magic under their breath. Sometimes the remedy was as simple as spitting lightly in the direction of the praised object, not out of rudeness, but to disrupt the harmful admiration. And then, of course, there were curses, intentional magical harm. A curse wasn't always a dramatic ritual. Often it was believed to be spoken casually in anger, muttered by a resentful neighbor, or whispered into the wind. Medieval villages were small, and everyone knew everyone. Arguments were common. Feuds could last years. If misfortune followed a quarrel, people connected the dots. Breaking a curse required someone with specific knowledge, a wise woman, a healer, a midwife, or an elder who knew the old ways. These individuals weren't witches in the later persecuted sense. They were respected, and sometimes feared, local problem solvers. They taught protective rituals, chalk marks on doors, herbs hung above beds, iron tools placed near cradles. To them, magic wasn't dramatic. It was woven quietly into daily routines. And yet, villagers didn't consider these practices magic the way we think of magic. They saw them as necessary precautions, like locking a door or reinforcing a fence. Danger could come from humans, spirits, or nature itself, and their practices helped maintain harmony in a world that always felt a little unstable. This brings us to an important point. Medieval villagers believed the natural world was alive with presence. Forests weren't empty. They were filled with beings, some helpful, some dangerous. Water sources had guardians, old trees contained spirits. Certain crossroads were places where the boundary between worlds thinned. People avoided certain spots at night, not out of superstition, but out of caution, learned from generations of warnings. Even everyday objects carried power. Iron repelled malevolent forces, so people hung horseshoes over doors or kept iron nails near the hearth. Salt cleansed negativity. Bread symbolized life and protection. Knots tied into strings or threads held spells, good or bad. A broom laid across a doorway prevented harmful spirits from entering. Ordinary villagers used these objects without thinking twice. They were part of the invisible defenses that protected a household. All of these beliefs served one purpose: to make sense of a world where explanations were scarce. Medieval villagers didn't have germ theory to explain disease or meteorology to explain storms. Their world was unpredictable, and superstition provided order. It didn't replace religion. It supplemented it, filling the gaps where official teachings offered no clear answers. When we understand their beliefs, we don't see ignorance or fear. We see practical wisdom. We see people trying to protect their families. We see communities interpreting the unknown with the tools they had. Their beliefs were the survival strategies of their time. In the next part, we'll look deeper at protective magic, the charms, rituals, symbols, herbs, and everyday actions villagers used to keep their homes safe and their lives in balance. If we want to understand medieval villagers, we need to understand their biggest priority: protection. Life in a medieval village wasn't just hard, it was unpredictable. Illness struck without warning. Weather ruined crops. Strangers passed through with unknown intentions. Even neighbors could become dangerous if they carried envy or resentment. In this world, survival wasn't just about farming or physical strength. It required constant spiritual and magical defense. To a medieval villager, protective magic wasn't mysterious, it wasn't hidden, and it certainly wasn't rare. It was as routine as tending livestock or sweeping the floor. You didn't wait for trouble to appear. You worked daily to keep it away. Let's start with something incredibly simple: the doorway. The entrance of a home was seen as the most vulnerable point, the place where spirits, curses, and unwanted energies could slip inside. So villagers guarded doorways with great care. They hung sprigs of rowan, hazel, or birch above the entrance. They wedged iron nails into the frame. They carved small crosses or symbols into the wood, blending Christian and older protective signs without a second thought. A horseshoe above the door wasn't just decoration, it was a shield. Iron, they believed, repelled harmful forces. Even the shape of the horseshoe mattered. It had to face upward like a cup, or the luck might spill out. Inside homes, another powerful protective object appeared again and again: salt. In the medieval imagination, salt was purity itself. It preserved food, prevented decay, and symbolically pushed away anything corrupt or evil. Villagers tossed a pinch of salt into a fire when they felt uneasy. They placed salt around cradles to keep infants safe. They sprinkled it across thresholds during weddings or important gatherings. Salt wasn't expensive, so even the poorest households could use it as a magical safeguard. Bread carried similar power. Bread was life. It symbolized nourishment, survival, and divine blessing. A piece of bread placed on a shelf or windowsill could protect a home from wandering spirits. Crumbs left out overnight were believed to appease helpful household beings. If a loaf fell upside down, it was quickly corrected. It was considered an omen of trouble if left that way. But protection wasn't just about objects. It was about actions. Small habits villagers performed almost without thinking. If someone spilled grain, they gathered it carefully to avoid attracting harmful forces through wastefulness. If they walked past a certain old tree or well-known haunted spot, they might whisper a greeting to the spirit believed to live there, acknowledging its presence and keeping it from feeling offended. If someone heard a strange sound at night, they crossed themselves or muttered a brief charm just to be safe. One of the most interesting protective habits involved knocking on wood, a gesture we still use today. Medieval villagers believed certain trees, especially oak, rowan, and ash, were sacred or inhabited by protective spirits. Knocking on wood was a way of calling for help, ensuring good fortune wasn't stolen by jealous or wandering energies. This tiny act carried centuries of tradition, and it linked villagers to the natural world around them. Herbs were another layer of defense. Medieval herbal knowledge didn't separate medicine from magic. Plants had power, both physically and spiritually. St. John's wort was burned to drive away evil spirits. Mugwort was worn during travel for protection. Yarrow was placed under pillows to ward off nightmares. Lavender and rosemary were added to wash water or hung from rafters to purify the air. These herbs weren't exotic. They grew in fields and gardens, ready to be used by anyone who knew their properties. Clothing could be magical, too. Mothers sewed tiny charms into their children's clothing, little packets of herbs, bits of iron, or scraps of blessed cloth. Adults wore amulets, often simple items, a carved wooden symbol, a small stone believed to have protective qualities, or a metal token blessed by a local priest. Jewelry wasn't just decorative. Brooches, pins, and rings often doubled as protective tools, especially if they contained symbolic shapes like circles, crosses, or knot patterns. And then there was the hearth, the beating heart of every medieval home. Fire was both life and danger. It cooked meals, warmed families, and kept darkness at bay. But fire also symbolized purity and transformation. Villagers treated the hearth with respect. They avoided letting it go out completely, especially on certain nights believed to be spiritually active. They placed protective herbs in the flames. They spoke blessings when lighting a new fire. The hearth was a sacred boundary between safety and the supernatural world outside. Beyond the home, protective magic extended to fields and livestock. Farmers blessed seeds before planting, sometimes combining Christian prayers with folk rituals. They placed small stones or symbols at the edges of their fields to keep harmful spirits from crossing in. When animals gave birth, people carried iron tools or spoke protective charms to ensure no malevolent force interfered. These protective practices weren't dramatic. They were quiet, constant, and deeply woven into everyday life. Medieval villagers lived with an awareness that the world was filled with powers they couldn't see but had to respect. These actions, placing herbs, knocking on wood, hanging iron above a door, gave people a sense of control in a world full of uncertainties. What's most striking is how these beliefs blended seamlessly into Christian life. People didn't see a contradiction. A villager might pray to a saint for protection and then add a sprig of rowan above the barn door. They might attend church in the morning and bury a protective charm at the corner of a field in the afternoon. These different systems of belief worked together, not against each other. And while some protective magic was gentle, some was defensive, meant to counter harmful forces like curses, envy, restless spirits, or witchcraft. These more intense beliefs formed the backbone of medieval anxieties and shaped how communities reacted when things went wrong. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into curses and malefic magic, how villagers believed harm was caused, how curses worked, and how they sought to undo them in times of fear and desperation. To understand medieval villagers, we have to understand their deepest fear, the idea that someone could intentionally harm you without ever touching you. Curses were not fantasy. They were part of the moral, emotional, and social landscape of every village. When misfortune struck, people didn't shrug and say bad luck. They looked for causes, and the possibility of a curse was always close at hand. In medieval thinking, magic didn't need dramatic rituals. It didn't require cauldrons, lightning, or eerie chanting. It could be as subtle as a spoken phrase, a jealous glance, or a handful of dust dropped in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Harm, villagers believed, traveled through intention. And intention, especially angry or envious intention, had power. This belief wasn't born out of fear alone. It came from living in tight communities where every person depended on every other person's goodwill. Neighbors shared wells, fields, tools, and livestock, and in such close quarters, resentment could grow quickly. An argument over grazing rights, a boundary dispute, a hurtful comment, or even a look of disdain could be interpreted as more than social tension. It could be a trigger for supernatural retaliation. The most common form of magical harm in medieval villages was the evil eye. Simply put, the evil eye was the harmful force of envy. Villagers believed that a person could unintentionally cast the evil eye just by admiring something too intensely. Praise wasn't always safe. Compliments could be dangerous if they were given with jealousy behind them, or even if they were given too enthusiastically. This is why many villagers responded to compliments with protective gestures like touching wood, making the sign of the cross, or quietly murmuring a charm under their breath. The evil eye especially threatened babies, livestock, and food, anything fragile or valuable. A baby suddenly crying after a visitor left? Suspicious? A cow refusing to let down its milk? Worrisome? A loaf of bread falling while baking? Potentially ominous. Villagers didn't see these moments as coincidences. They saw them as disruptions in the balance between people. But the evil eye was only one layer. Deliberate curses, acts of intentional magical harm, were feared far more deeply. A curse didn't need to be elaborate. It might be a muttered phrase during a moment of anger. It might be a whispered wish that misfortune would come to someone. It might be a symbolic gesture, like tying a knot with malicious intent or placing a harmful token near someone's door. Medieval villagers believed objects could carry negative energy. A dead animal placed strategically, a bundle of sticks arranged in a pattern, or even footprints disturbed in a peculiar way. These gestures didn't need witnesses. Their power came from belief itself. If the community believed certain actions could cause harm, then the psychological weight of fear could magnify every small misfortune that followed. And misfortune always followed something. A child's sudden fever might start a chain reaction of suspicion, a broken tool, a sick chicken, a patch of crops failing for no visible reason. Each event became a thread in a pattern. People connected the dots. Fear filled the spaces between those dots. And soon, a family or individual might quietly become the suspected source of a curse. Yet the medieval idea of curses wasn't entirely about assigning blame. It was also about restoring balance. Villagers believed that harm created a disturbance in the natural order, a disturbance that needed to be corrected. This belief made healers, wise women, and folk practitioners essential. They were not witches in the later persecuted sense. They were troubleshooters, mediators between the natural and supernatural worlds. If someone believed they had been cursed, they sought help immediately. The remedies varied widely from region to region, but a few methods were common. 1. Unbinding rituals. Many curses were believed to work through binding, tying, knotting, or constricting energy. So untying knots, cutting cords, or performing symbolic releases could free the victim from harm. 2. Smoke purification. Burning herbs like mugwort, rosemary, or blessed branches was believed to clear negativity. Smoke was seen as a purifier that traveled through invisible realms. 3. Iron protection. Placing an iron nail, knife, or horseshoe near the affected person or animal supposedly broke the curse. Iron represented strength and repelled harmful forces. 4. Salt cleansing. Salt was sprinkled around beds, barns, or doorways to absorb and neutralize dangerous energies. 5. Counter charms. Spoken formulas, half prayer, half magic, were recited with deliberate rhythm. These weren't dramatic spells, they were murmured words passed down through generations, often invoking God, saints, or natural forces. For villagers, these remedies weren't irrational. They were logical steps in a problem-solving process. Everything had a cause. Everything could be remedied. Still, some misfortune ran deeper. Some curses were believed to attach themselves not just to a person, but to a place, a family line, or an object. People avoided certain trees or wells because something happened there long ago. They refused to bring certain belongings into their homes because that item carries mischief. Objects could hold harm like sponges soaked with poison. This idea gave rise to cursed places, locations where tragedies repeated themselves, or where villagers felt uneasy. Roads where travelers often vanished, bridges struck frequently by lightning, forest clearings where animals refused to graze. These weren't just geographical quirks. They were signs of deeper spiritual imbalance. The fear of curses also shaped social behavior. Villagers learned to avoid unnecessary conflict. They offered small gifts to smooth over arguments. They apologized quickly when tempers flared. They avoided openly showing envy or resentment. In a world where emotions could become magical weapons, kindness wasn't just virtue, it was protection. It's important to remember that medieval villagers didn't live in constant terror. They lived in constant awareness. Harm was possible, but so were solutions. Magic wasn't an enemy. It was part of their toolkit for navigating a world filled with uncertainty. And curses were only one side of the coin. The other side was omens, the signs people believed the world sent to warn, guide, or prepare them. In the next part, we'll dive into the realm of omens, signs, and everyday predictions, how medieval villagers interpreted the world around them and found meaning in even the smallest events. For medieval villagers, the world was a vast book filled with symbols, and every person was expected to read it. Not in the way we read today, through letters and ink, but through nature, weather, animals, and daily accidents, each offering clues about what might come next. Nothing was meaningless. Everything could be a message. In the medieval mindset, life didn't unfold randomly. Events were woven together into a grand pattern, one that humans could understand if they paid attention. This was not superstition in their eyes. It was observation, sharpened over generations. Let's begin with the sky, one of the most important sources of omens. A ring around the moon meant bad weather approaching. A blood-red sunset might signal war or unrest. Sudden lightning out of a clear sky was never just unusual. It was a sign that supernatural forces were stirring. An eclipse, rare and dramatic, was a moment of awe and fear. Villagers often believed such events meant kings would die, disasters would strike, or the spiritual world was shifting. But the sky spoke in quieter ways, too. A robin singing unusually early in the season meant prosperity. A lone cloud drifting in the wrong direction could signify something strange or unsettling. Medieval villagers had no meteorology, but they had centuries of tradition telling them how to interpret atmospheric signs. These interpretations shaped farming decisions, travel plans, and even emotional expectations for the days to come. Animals were constant messengers in this symbolic landscape. Medieval villagers lived so closely with nature that animal behavior was impossible to ignore. A dog howling in the middle of the night was almost universally believed to be a warning of death, either in the household or somewhere nearby. Birds, especially, were thought to carry spiritual messages. A crow sitting on a roof could be a bad omen. A magpie alone suggested mischief. Two magpies together might signal good fortune. A bird tapping at a window was feared as an omen of sickness. Even livestock communicated signs. A cow lowing strangely might indicate a coming storm. A hen crowing like a rooster was an unmistakable sign that something was out of balance. When bees suddenly abandoned their hive, villagers feared that someone in the household might soon abandon life itself. These weren't dramatic superstitions. They were everyday interpretations that shaped how people acted and felt. Water offered its own omens. Wells were especially important, seen not just as sources of water, but as portals to deeper realms. If the water suddenly turned cloudy or moved strangely, villagers believed spiritual forces were involved. Streams that changed course, springs that dried unexpectedly, or lakes that produced unusual reflections were all signs that something significant was unfolding. Fire, too, was full of meaning. If a candle sputtered or cracked, it might indicate an argument erupting soon. If the fire smoked excessively for no clear reason, someone in the household might be under spiritual attack or emotional strain. Fire was life, warmth, and protection, but it was also a medium for messages. Its behavior mattered. Then there were body-related omens, subtle signals believed to foreshadow events. An itching palm suggested money would change hands. A sudden chill meant someone was walking over your future grave. A twitching eye hinted that news, good or bad, was on the way. Sneezing carried its own meanings, often connected to blessings or warnings depending on the region. Medieval villagers paid attention to their bodies because they saw themselves as directly connected to the greater forces around them. Omens weren't only warnings, they were also guides. Medieval people used them to plan their lives. For example, the first animal seen on New Year's morning could set the tone for the year. The direction of the wind at dawn could indicate luck for travelers. The behavior of birds before planting season could shape decisions about when to sow crops. The appearance of certain insects predicted harvest outcomes. This wasn't randomness. It was tradition, observation, and belief working together. Many omens were tied to important life events. Before a wedding, villagers watched for signs. A sudden rain shower was good luck. A broken object was bad. During childbirth, any strange noises, animal behavior, or household accidents could be interpreted as spiritual messages. Death, especially, produced a flurry of omens: candles flickering, cats behaving oddly, clocks stopping, or the sudden quieting of birds. If omens suggested danger, villagers took action. They used charms, prayers, protective herbs, or symbolic gestures to counteract the negative sign. The moment an omen appeared, villagers shifted into a kind of spiritual readiness. They didn't simply accept misfortune, they tried to stay ahead of it. It's important to realize that medieval villagers didn't see themselves as passive recipients of fate. Omens didn't dictate their lives, they informed them. People believed they could respond, prepare, and protect themselves. In that response, they found agency in a world full of unpredictable forces. Interestingly, omens often blended Christian belief with older folk traditions. A shooting star might be interpreted as a sign of a soul leaving purgatory. A rainbow might symbolize divine promise. Yet, The same villagers would also interpret the movement of clouds or the behavior of ravens in ways older than Christianity itself. Their worldview wasn't divided, it was layered. Church teachings explained some events, while folk wisdom explained others. Omens provided structure in a world without scientific explanations. Today, weather apps and medical knowledge explain what medieval villagers experienced as signs. But in their time, meaning was essential. If you lived in a world full of risks, disease, poor, harvests, storms, and constant hard labor, feeling that the universe sent clues was comforting. It made life feel navigable. Omens also strengthened community bonds. When something unusual happened, a strange animal cry or an odd light in the sky, people discussed it together. They debated its meaning, shared interpretations, and adjusted their plans accordingly. These shared beliefs created cohesion and helped villages act collectively in times of uncertainty. And omens were only one part of a larger spiritual landscape filled with supernatural beings, spirits, ghosts, fairies, the dead, and other entities believed to move through the edges of daily life. In the next part, we'll explore the invisible world of spirits and other worldly creatures, the beings medieval villagers believed lived alongside them, influencing fields, forests, rivers, and homes. To truly understand medieval villagers, we have to step into the world they believed existed alongside their own, a world invisible to modern eyes, yet absolutely present to them. This wasn't a fantasy realm. It was a living layer of reality, woven into fields, forests, homes, and even the air they breathed. In villages where darkness fell early, where forests stretched for miles, and where silence often carried its own weight, people believed the unseen world was just as real and sometimes more powerful than the physical one. Let's begin with a simple truth of medieval belief. The land itself was alive. Every stretch of ground, every bend in a river, every ancient tree or lonely hilltop was thought to have a spirit associated with it. These spirits weren't always good or evil, they simply existed, each with its own nature and temperament. Field spirits protected crops, but could become angered if the land was mistreated. Water spirits inhabited wells, streams, and ponds, guarding the purity of the water. Forest spirits watched over wild animals, punishing those who hunted with disrespect. These beings weren't imaginary companions, they were forces to be respected. Villagers took care never to anger them. This meant avoiding loud oaths near sacred trees, not drawing too much water from certain wells, and leaving a small portion of the first harvest as an offering. A bit of bread, a splash of ale, a sprig of herbs, small gifts that said, "We acknowledge your presence." The boundaries between the human world and the spirit world were thin. Some places were considered dangerous crossings where that boundary almost disappeared. Lonely crossroads, abandoned houses, old burial mounds, ruined walls, and dense patches of woodland at dusk were believed to be spiritually active. People traveled cautiously near these sites, especially at night. If a villager had to cross such a place, they might whisper a prayer, carry a protective charm, or avoid looking directly into the shadows. One of the most deeply rooted beliefs was in household spirits, beings who lived in the home or barn and watched over the family. They were not cute or harmless, they were respected, even feared. These household spirits could bring prosperity or disaster depending on how they were treated. If shown respect, they protected livestock, kept grain safe, and guarded the home from evil. If offended, they caused objects to break, food to spoil, and animals to fall ill. Villagers responded to this unseen presence by keeping their homes orderly, leaving small offerings at night, and avoiding unnecessary noise or disrespect within the house. Even sweeping dust out the door after sunset could offend the spirit, so such tasks were done carefully. Beyond these domestic beings lay ghosts, the spirits of the dead. Medieval people believed the line between living and dead was thin and porous. If the dead felt unsettled, if their burial was improper, if their possessions were mishandled, or if unfinished business weighed on them, they might return. Ghosts didn't always appear as floating, translucent figures. Sometimes their presence was felt through sounds, cold spots, moving objects, or disturbing dreams. Villagers interpreted these signs as warnings or messages. Ghosts were often believed to come with intention. Some returned to guide loved ones or warn them of danger. Others came because they were restless or angry. A ghost that lingered too long threatened the harmony of the village, so priests and folk practitioners performed rituals to help the dead find peace. Sometimes this was done through prayer, sometimes through symbolic acts, like placing items at a grave, burning certain herbs, or performing gestures meant to sever the ghost's ties to the living world. Then there were fairies and other otherworldly beings, whose reputations varied wildly from region to region. Some were seen as beautiful and benevolent, others as mischievous or even malevolent. Villagers believed fairies lived in specific places, hilltops, standing stones, ancient mounds, or areas where wildflowers grew in unusual abundance. These places were treated with caution. People avoided disturbing fairy rings, those natural circles in the grass. They didn't pick certain wildflowers at night. They didn't build houses on hills believed to belong to the good people, as fairies were often called. Crossing their territory without respect could bring misfortune, sudden illness, lost livestock, missing items, or even a strange shift in personality attributed to fairy interference. Fairies were especially feared when it came to children. Many medieval communities believed in the possibility of changeling events, where a fairy might steal a human baby and leave behind a fairy child or a sickly look-alike. This belief, though unsettling, shaped how villagers protected infants. They kept iron objects near cradles, watched newborns around the clock, and avoided praising a child too strongly in public. Their goal was to avoid attracting supernatural attention. The unseen world also included roving spirits, wild, wandering forces that swept through countryside at night. One of the most common medieval beliefs was in the wild hunt, a spectral procession said to gallop across the sky on stormy nights. Villagers who heard distant thunder or the howl of the wind twisting strangely through the trees might believe the hunt was passing overhead. It was dangerous to witness, they said. Those who saw it could be whisked away, cursed, or doomed to misfortune. The proper response was to stay indoors, shutters closed, fires bright, and protective charms at the ready. All these beliefs, household spirits, land spirits, ghosts, fairies, and supernatural forces, were not separate categories in medieval minds. They formed a vast, interconnected spiritual ecosystem. Medieval villagers didn't classify supernatural beings like modern researchers. Instead, they lived within the belief that the natural and supernatural constantly interacted. This worldview shaped daily behavior. People avoided certain areas at night. They respected thresholds and old stones. They didn't whistle after sundown in some regions, for fear it might summon something unintended. They explained strange noises not as wind, but as spirits passing through. They lived with a sense that the world around them was layered, alive, and listening. But spirits weren't always the source of fear. Sometimes harm came from other humans using supernatural means. And that brings us to one of the most complex and misunderstood aspects of medieval belief: witchcraft, not as a fantasy trope, but as villagers understood it. In the next part, we'll explore how medieval villagers viewed witches, wise women, healers, and magical practitioners, and how these beliefs shaped community tensions, social roles, and everyday fears. In the medieval village, magic wasn't an abstract idea found only in dusty manuscripts or whispered legends. It lived in the hands of real people, neighbors, midwives, healers, shepherds, and elders who carried the knowledge of herbs, charms, and unseen forces. But this knowledge existed under a shadow, one that shaped how villagers viewed anyone who seemed to possess unusual skills. To understand their beliefs, we have to remember one crucial reality. Medieval villagers did not see witches the way later centuries did. This was long before the infamous witch hunts. In earlier medieval Europe, the idea of someone making a formal pact with the devil hadn't yet taken hold among everyday villagers. Instead, people believed in folk magic practitioners, individuals with specialized knowledge who could either help or harm. There were three broad types of magical figures in village life, each viewed with a mix of respect, dependency, and suspicion. The wise woman or cunning man. Every village had at least one person who was known for knowing things. These individuals were midwives, herbalists, charm makers, or simply people with intuitive understanding of the rhythms of nature. Everyone visited them. The sick went for healing remedies. Farmers sought advice for protecting livestock. Mothers brought infants for blessings. Young couples asked for charms to ensure fertility or harmonious marriage. The wise woman wasn't an outsider. She was part of the community. Without her, childbirth was more dangerous, illness more threatening, curses more frightening. Her craft filled the gaps that Christian clergy could not always address, especially in remote villages. But this reliance came with a silent tension. Knowledge was power, and power made people uneasy. If someone who could heal could also harm, where was the boundary? Wise women operated in that delicate space, respected, needed, yet quietly feared. The charmer or curer. These were specialists who dealt with the supernatural directly. They could remove curses, break the evil eye, detect the source of misfortune, read objects or wounds, perform protective rituals. Their methods blended prayer and pagan tradition. A charm might begin with, "In the name of the Father," and end with an incantation older than Christianity itself. Villagers didn't see a contradiction here. They believed spiritual power had many layers, and a good practitioner knew how to draw on all of them. Charmers were often ordinary villagers with seemingly extraordinary insight. They might know how to whisper a charm into a child's ear to banish nightmares, trace symbols over a sick animal, burn certain herbs to drive away harmful spirits, use knots, threads, and patterns to bind or unbind magical forces. Their practice felt close to everyday life, nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just quiet acts of protection meant to restore spiritual balance. The suspected witch. Unlike wise women and charmers, a suspected witch wasn't a helper. She, or sometimes he, was a figure villagers feared, someone believed to use supernatural abilities for harm. But, and this is essential, medieval villagers didn't imagine witches the way modern entertainment portrays them. There were no broomsticks, no covens casting spells under the moon, no formal witchcraft religion. Instead, a witch was someone who had a reputation for bitterness or envy, was involved in frequent disputes, was socially isolated, had misfortune follow them, was associated with suspicious events. If a quarrel with a neighbor was followed by a string of bad luck, villagers might whisper about witchcraft. If someone seemed to harbor grudges, they might be suspected of magical retaliation. If a person knew too much, too little, or behaved too strangely, the suspicion sharpened. It was never about dramatic magic. It was about malicious intent amplified by superstition. a suspected witch was believed capable of spoiling milk, withering crops, causing animals to fall ill, sending nightmares, inflicting strange ailments, influencing weather. Again, these were not supernatural spectacles, they were subtle, everyday harms that deeply affected village life. Suspicion could arise from something as small as a muttered insult, a piercing stare, a refusal to exchange greetings, a sudden drop in temperature, a shadow at the window at dusk. And in a world where survival hung in fragile balance, these signs carried tremendous weight. Blending Christianity and magic. One of the most remarkable aspects of medieval belief is how seamlessly Christian and pagan traditions fused together in the daily lives of villagers. A wise woman might use a Christian prayer, an herbal remedy with pagan roots, a charm based on local folklore, a symbol drawn from ancient traditions. Villagers didn't separate these systems. To them, they were all part of the vast spiritual landscape of the world. God ruled the heavens, but the fields, forests, and homes were filled with older, quieter powers that demanded respect. Priests, too, found themselves navigating this blended world. Some condemned folk magic outright. Others looked the other way, understanding that villagers simply wanted protection in a world filled with danger. A priest might perform an exorcism for a villager who believed spirits had entered their home, but that same villager would go home and hang rowan branches over the door, combining Christian ritual with folk tradition. Fear and fascination. Medieval villagers lived in a constant tug-of-war between fascination and fear. Magic offered solutions when official channels failed, but magic also created anxiety because it was unpredictable. Those who practiced it walked a thin line. Wise women could become feared witches with shocking speed if misfortune followed them. A respected charmer could be accused of crossing into harmful magic if a ritual backfired. A socially isolated villager could become the focus of community paranoia simply because someone needed to blame someone. But even at their most fearful, villagers didn't see magical practitioners as belonging to a separate world. They were woven into the fabric of the community, people of knowledge, mystery, and potential danger whose skills were both valued and mistrusted. In the next part, we'll explore healing magic, herbal remedies, and the deep connection medieval villagers saw between nature and health. How illness was understood not just medically, but spiritually, and how healing often required addressing both the body and the unseen forces surrounding it. If you truly want to step inside the mind of a medieval villager, you have to understand how they viewed illness. To them, sickness wasn't just a physical condition. It was a spiritual disturbance, an imbalance between the body, the world, and the unseen forces that shaped everyday life. Illness wasn't random. It had reasons, and those reasons mattered. In a time long before germ theory, hospitals, or reliable medicine, healing was a layered and deeply symbolic process. Villagers approached illness with a toolkit made of herbs, prayers, charms, rituals, and ancient knowledge passed down by generations who survived by observation, intuition, and a belief that nature itself held the secrets to life and death. Let's begin with the most important idea. Nature was medicine, and medicine was magic. Herbs were not simply ingredients. They were living allies with personalities, strengths, and spiritual properties. Medieval healers believed each plant carried a specific essence. Some attracted blessings, some repelled evil, and others balanced the body's internal humors. To the villagers, plants didn't work despite superstition. They worked because superstition and natural remedy were intertwined. Take St. John's wort, bright yellow and blooming around midsummer. Villagers believed it was powerful not only for healing wounds, but for driving away evil spirits. It wasn't just applied to injuries. It was hung in doorways, placed near beds, or burned to cleanse a space. Mugwort, a plant connected to protection, was used to soothe stomach problems, but also tied around ankles for safe travel. Yarrow stopped bleeding and also protected against curses. Elder was revered as a sacred tree whose blossoms healed fever, but whose branches were never cut without permission from the spirit believed to dwell within. Healers didn't just prescribe herbs, they respected them. They gathered plants at specific times of day or phases of the moon. They avoided harvesting in certain seasons or without speaking a quiet blessing. These actions weren't superstition to them. They ensured the plant's spirit was awakened correctly and its power fully activated. Villagers also believed the body's health depended on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, borrowed from ancient medical theory. But this wasn't purely academic. It blended seamlessly with folk magic. If a person suffered from melancholy, healers might prescribe calming herbs and perform a ritual to lift spiritual heaviness. If someone had a fever, cooling herbs like mint might be used along with protective charms to counteract the heat of a magical influence. Sickness often had social meaning, too. If a person suddenly fell ill with no obvious cause, villagers wondered who or what might be behind it. Was it a curse? A wandering spirit? A fairy's mischief? A broken taboo? Illness didn't just affect the patient. It shook the entire household, forcing everyone to re-examine recent interactions, arguments, or strange events. This is why healing rituals often began with diagnosis of the invisible. A healer might ask, "Has anyone visited recently and behaved strangely? Did anyone compliment your livestock or child too strongly? Did you pass a place known to be spiritually dangerous? Was something found near your door that didn't belong there? Were there unusual noises, dreams, or omens beforehand?" To us, these questions seem unrelated. To medieval villagers, they were essential for uncovering the root cause. Healing itself could be elaborate or simple. At its heart was the idea that the boundary between prayer and magic did not exist. A healing ritual might involve reciting Christian prayers, whispering ancient charms, burning herbs, placing iron under the patient's bed, tying knots in thread to bind the illness, laying blessed bread on the forehead, making the sign of the cross using herbal smoke. One of the most fascinating practices was charm speaking. These were spoken formulas combining rhythm, repetition, and symbolism. A charm might invoke God, angels, saints, and natural forces all at once. By the blessing of the sun, the strength of the earth, and the grace of the Holy Trinity. To villagers, these weren't contradictions. They were layers of protection. Midwives were especially important healers. They helped deliver babies, treated mothers, offered protective charms for newborns, and intervened when labor went wrong. Their knowledge of herbs was vast, so vast that the church sometimes viewed them with suspicion. Yet villages could not survive without them. Midwives knew which plants eased pain, which prevented infection, and which calmed anxiety. They knew how to swaddle infants, diagnose complications, and perform rituals to protect babies from malevolent forces. In many villages, midwives were the only consistent medical experts for miles. Healing also involved symbols, objects believed to channel protective energy. Rowan or ash branches, iron tools or knives, stone amulets, religious medals, knotted threads, blessed candles. These items were placed near the sick person, tied to their clothing, or hung above their bed. Their effectiveness wasn't judged by scientific outcome, but by tradition and testimony. If someone said it worked in the past, villagers believed it would work again. Water played a major role as well. Certain springs were believed to have healing power. Pilgrimages to holy wells were common, even in tiny villages. People washed wounds in these waters, drank from them to cure ailments, or left offerings by the well's edge. When an illness was believed to be caused by a curse or supernatural force, healing became more intense. A healer might perform a counter-ritual, tracing protective symbols in the air, reciting powerful charms backward to undo harm, or burning specific herbs to drive out malevolent influences. Sometimes they used fire and water together, passing the sick person through smoke while sprinkling blessed water on them. The goal wasn't just to heal the body, it was to restore harmony. Illness could also be communal. If livestock fell sick, if many villagers suffered similar symptoms, or if children suddenly showed strange behaviors, entire communities participated in protective rituals. Everyone understood that health was not just an individual matter, it was woven into the spiritual fabric of the whole village, and when physical remedies failed, villagers turned to saints. Certain saints were believed to specialize in specific ailments. People prayed to Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Blaise for throat problems, Saint Roch for plague and infections, Saint Margaret for childbirth, Saint Anthony for skin conditions. They visited shrines, offered candles, or touched relics in hopes of divine intervention. To medieval people, healing wasn't a single act. It was a relationship between the human world, the natural world, and the spiritual world. Every illness was a reminder that these realms were connected, and every cure was proof that balance could be restored. In the next part, we'll explore the rituals and beliefs surrounding birth, death, and major life transitions, moments when, in the medieval mind, the veil between worlds was thinnest. In the medieval village, not all moments of life carried equal weight. Some were ordinary, planting, harvesting, cooking, mending, rhythms repeated day after day. But others were moments of passage when a person moved from one state of existence into another. These were the thin places, times when villagers believed the veil between the physical world and the unseen world grew fragile. And at these thresholds, birth, marriage, and death, superstitions and folk magic were at their most powerful. Let's begin with birth, one of the most vulnerable and spiritually charged moments in medieval life. Childbirth was dangerous. Women faced risks with no medical safety net. Infants could die suddenly from causes no one understood. In a world where life hung by a thread, villagers believed that supernatural forces paid close attention to new beginnings, sometimes to bless, sometimes to harm. Before labor even began, families took precautions. Pregnant women avoided certain paths believed to be crossed by spirits. They kept iron near their sleeping area to repel malevolent beings. Charms like knotted threads, protective herbs, or blessed wax tablets were carried or worn discreetly. It wasn't vanity, it was survival. When labor started, it was usually midwives who took charge. They knew the body, but they also knew the rituals of protection. Midwives whispered prayers, placed symbolic objects near the bed, or quietly marked crosses on doors, beams, or even the mother's skin using soot or ash. Some midwives called upon saints known for protecting mothers, like St. Margaret or St. Anne. Others used older practices, burning herbs to purify the room, tying knots to hold in the mother's strength, or untying every knot in the house so nothing impeded the baby's arrival. After birth, the infant's vulnerability continued. Medieval villagers believed newborns attracted attention from all kinds of supernatural forces, ghosts, fairies, spirits, and those who wished harm. To protect them, families. placed iron tools or keys near the cradle, pinned a small piece of red cloth to the baby's clothing, avoided leaving the child alone for even a moment, kept candles burning at night, hung herbs above the bed. Perhaps the strongest fear was of changelings, the belief that fairies might steal a healthy human baby and replace it with a sickly or uncanny substitute. Whether this belief was literal or symbolic, villagers took it seriously. A crying infant, a child who failed to grow, or one with unusual behavior might be interpreted through this lens. But equally powerful were the rituals welcoming a child into the human community. Baptism, in particular, served as both a Christian sacrament and a spiritual shield. Before baptism, a child was believed to be spiritually exposed. After it, they were under divine protection. In many villages, families rushed to baptize newborns as soon as possible, not just for religious salvation, but to safeguard the infant's soul from wandering spirits. If birth was one threshold, death was another, and perhaps the most spiritually charged transition of all. Death in a medieval village wasn't silent or sanitary, it was intimate. Families cared for the dying at home. The sounds, the smells, the uncertainty, all of it unfolded in the same rooms where they cooked, slept, and prayed. And because death moved through familiar spaces, villagers believed it stirred unseen forces as well. When someone approached death, certain signs were watched closely. A candle going out suddenly, a dog howling, a clock stopping, a bird tapping at the window, an unexpected chill entering the room. These weren't coincidences. They were confirmations that the boundary between worlds was thinning. Villagers believed the dying person's spirit sometimes lingered near the body or wandered through the house. To help them pass peacefully, families performed quiet rituals, opening a window so the soul could leave, placing candles to guide the departing spirit, or removing mirrors so the soul wouldn't get trapped inside its reflection. Some covered water basins, believing spirits were drawn to still water. Once the person died, the household shifted into a ritual mode. The body was washed, dressed, and prepared, acts that were both practical and sacred. During this time, villagers believed other spirits might try to enter the home, attracted by the presence of death. So protective measures intensified, iron tools placed at windows, herbs scattered near doors, prayers spoken softly while the body rested. Funeral practices varied, but many involved a blend of Christian rites and older traditions. Bells were rung not only to honor the dead, but to ward off malevolent beings drawn by the sound of mourning. Offerings of bread or coins might be placed with the body, remnants of pre-Christian customs adapted into new religious frameworks. But after a burial, the connection wasn't fully severed. Medieval villagers believed the dead could return, not always maliciously, but often out of restlessness or unfinished business. This is where ghost lore intertwined with daily belief. If strange noises echoed at night, if livestock behaved oddly, or if a household felt heavy, villagers wondered whether a spirit was near. Specialists, often the same wise women who delivered babies, performed rituals to help placate or dismiss restless souls. Sometimes offerings were made at the grave. Sometimes prayers were spoken in the home. Sometimes herbs were burned to clear the path between worlds. Birth and death weren't the only moments where villagers turned to magic. Life transitions, such as marriage and coming of age, held their own rituals. Weddings, for example, were filled with protective measures. A bride might carry herbs to ensure fertility. Guests avoided certain phrases to keep away jealousy. The groom performed symbolic gestures to ward off misfortune. Marriage wasn't just a legal union, it was a spiritual merging that needed shielding from envy and supernatural interference. And in every stage of life, villagers believed misfortune could slip in quietly if precautions weren't taken. That's why these rituals mattered so much. They provided order during moments when the soul was vulnerable, when life shifted, and when forces beyond human understanding felt closest. Birth welcomed a new soul. Death released a departing one. Marriage bound two families. Illness tested the balance of worlds. And in all these transitions, villagers relied on rituals, some Christian, some pagan, many a blend of both, to keep themselves grounded in a world where the seen and unseen constantly intertwined. In the next part, we'll explore folk magic used in farming, weather prediction, and protection of livestock, the practical side of magic that shaped everyday survival. To truly grasp the mindset of medieval villagers, we must step into the fields, because nothing shaped their daily lives more than the harvest. Food meant survival. A good year brought security. A bad year meant hunger, disease, or even death. And because so much depended on forces beyond human control, sunlight, rain, wind, soil, pests, villagers saw farming not as a simple act of labor, but as a partnership with the natural and supernatural worlds. In the medieval imagination, a field was never just a field, it was a living space filled with energies, spirits, blessings, and dangers. Earth was sacred, not metaphorically, but literally. It held memory, fertility, and the potential for life. And because of this, farming was infused with ritual, superstition, and folk magic, all meant to keep nature in balance. Let's begin with the planting season, a time when everything felt fragile. Before a single seed touched the ground, villagers prepared spiritually as well as physically. Some farmers walked the edges of their fields with a candle or torch, believing light would drive away harmful forces lurking at the boundaries. Others buried charms, including stones carved with symbols, sprigs of rowan, or bits of iron, at the corners of their land to protect the crop from envy, storms, and supernatural interference. Seeds themselves were treated as more than agricultural material. Many villagers blessed their seeds before planting, mixing Christian prayers with older rites. A farmer might cross himself, recite a charm, or sprinkle the seeds with holy water. Some believed the first handful of seeds had to be sown in complete silence to avoid attracting negative spirits. Others believed the first sowing should be done by the oldest or most experienced member of the household, someone whose hands carried wisdom and luck. The weather, unpredictable and often brutal, was viewed through a lens of spiritual meaning. Rain wasn't simply water, it was a blessing from above or a warning from unseen powers. Too much rain might indicate divine displeasure or malevolent magic affecting the sky. Too little rain might be blamed on witches stealing moisture or on spirits withholding their favor. To influence weather, villagers practiced rituals that seem strange today, but were entirely logical in their belief system. For example, beating drums or clanging metal objects to break up storms, carrying burning torches around fields to summon warmth or drive away frost, placing lit candles in windows to encourage rain to fall gently rather than violently, floating bread on water to ask for balance between wet and dry seasons. Some communities even performed rituals on hilltops to call the weather, believing high places held stronger spiritual connections to the sky. Wind was its own force. A sudden shift in wind direction could signal magic at work. If the wind blew from a direction associated with misfortune, villagers responded with protective gestures. Even the simple act of closing shutters was done with awareness. Wind carried more than air. It carried power. Livestock, central to survival, were also protected with magic. Cows, sheep, goats, and horses were vulnerable to disease and injury, and villagers believed malevolent forces targeted them frequently. To protect animals, farmers used iron nails hammered into barn doors, rowan branches tied above stable entrances, charms hung around animals' necks, herbs burned inside barns to create protective smoke, blessed water sprinkled along stall floors. Whenever a calf or foal was born, villagers took precautions to ensure supernatural forces didn't interfere. The mother might be circled with a burning candle or herbs to keep away spirits. The newborn might be touched with iron or sprinkled with salt before nursing. Pests and crop diseases were another constant fear. Medieval villagers didn't blame insects alone, they blamed imbalance. If pests appeared in large numbers, villagers asked why. Had someone cast harmful magic? Had the land spirit been offended? Had envy from a neighbor drawn misfortune into the field? Some rituals involved symbolic actions. For example, carrying the first captured pest across the village boundary to remove the infestation, drawing circles in the soil to trap harmful forces, chanting special rhymes while walking in patterns through the fields. Even tools held magical significance. The plow had a symbolic role in many rituals. It wasn't just a device, but a spiritual instrument. Some farmers wiped the plow blade with special herbs. Others avoided letting certain people touch the plow, fearing bad intentions could seep into the soil. The harvest season brought its own superstitions. Cutting the first sheaf of grain was an act filled with meaning. Who cut it mattered. The direction in which it fell mattered. The behavior of birds in the field during harvest mattered. Some believed the spirit of the crop, the corn mother or field spirit, lived in the grain and had to be treated respectfully. The final sheaf of the harvest was often kept aside, decorated or placed near the hearth as a token of gratitude and a promise of future fertility. Bonfires were common in many regions during key agricultural moments. Fire was seen as purifying, energizing, and protective. Villagers jumped over flames, circled fields with burning torches, or burned old tools to cleanse them spiritually. All these practices weren't random. They were part of a worldview that believed every part of life required cooperation between humans and unseen forces. Farming wasn't only physical labor, it was communication. Rituals were a language spoken to the land, weather, and spirits. Villagers believed that if they performed their duties respectfully, nature would respond in kind. At the heart of all this was fear of imbalance. The medieval world was fragile. A single harsh winter could wipe out a village. A single storm could destroy the year's crops. A disease among livestock could ruin families. Because so much was at stake, villagers relied not just on skill, but on ritual. But the fields weren't the only place where magic shaped survival. Inside the home, in the quiet routines of daily life, superstition guided behaviors just as strongly. In the next part, we'll explore everyday domestic magic, the small rituals and beliefs woven into cooking, cleaning, household organization, and the effort to maintain harmony within the home. For medieval villagers, the home was more than a shelter. It was a magical sphere, a boundary between safety and the chaotic forces of the outside world. The hearth wasn't just a place for cooking, it was the heart of spiritual protection. Every pot stirred, every broom swept, every door opened or closed carried meaning. If the fields were where villagers wrestled with nature, the home was where they negotiated with the unseen. Let's begin with the most important place in the home, the hearth, the living fire. Fire was life. It warmed bodies, cooked food, dried clothes, and protected families. To let the hearth fire die unexpectedly was more than an inconvenience. It was a spiritual failing. A dead hearth signaled vulnerability. It meant the home's protective barrier had weakened. Some villages even believed an extinguished hearth left a doorway open for wandering spirits. So families protected their fire at all costs. They banked it at night under ashes. They carried coals carefully from one house to another if a neighbor needed help. Lighting someone's hearth from your own fire was an act of generosity and spiritual bonding. Lighting it with malice or refusing to share was the kind of gesture that could spark rumors of witchcraft or ill intent. Even how the fire behaved carried messages. A crackling flame meant visitors were coming. A sudden flare suggested tension. Smoke drifting into the room indicated spiritual disturbance or coming misfortune. Medieval villagers read the hearth like a book, interpreting signs in the flicker and hiss. Cooking, too, was infused with magical meaning. Bread, for instance, wasn't only food, it symbolized life and protection. Dropping a loaf on its top was considered dangerous. Some believed it invited evil into the home. Flipping it upright was essential. Spilling salt was a bad omen, but tossing a pinch over the left shoulder neutralized it. The first spoonful of a new pot of stew was often offered silently to the household spirit, a gesture of respect. Some families placed small pieces of bread on the windowsill for wandering souls or benevolent beings who might bring good luck in return. The kitchen tools themselves carried protective power. Iron pots and knives defended the home against spirits. In some places, knives were left sticking upward in the table overnight, not as a threat to intruders, but as a spiritual barrier. Wooden spoons, carved with symbols, were believed to stir blessings into food. Moving around the home, we arrive at the doorway, the most spiritually exposed part of any dwelling. Doors weren't just openings, they were thresholds, and thresholds demanded protection. Villagers hung objects above the door to keep negative forces out. Iron horseshoes, carved symbols, dried herbs, small bags of salt, or even animal bones. Visitors entering the home brought their own energies. Some households insisted on greeting guests immediately upon entry so that no wandering harm could slip in behind them. In certain regions, it was bad luck for a guest to enter before the homeowner invited them in, a rule born from fear of uninvited spirits. Floor sweeping had magical rules, too. Sweeping toward the door could sweep luck out of the house if done carelessly. Sweeping after sunset was considered risky. It might disturb spirits or anger the household guardians. Some avoided sweeping on certain days, fearing it would disrupt spiritual harmony or attract misfortune. Water, like fire, held symbolic weight. Buckets filled it. Wells carried blessings or danger, depending on the time of day. Morning water was seen as pure. Water drawn at night was suspicious, possibly touched by unseen forces. Spilling water carelessly could be interpreted as an omen. Pouring it out at the wrong moment or in the wrong direction invited gossip. The bedroom was an even more spiritually charged space. Sleep made people vulnerable. To protect themselves, villagers placed iron tools under pillows, hung herbs near the bed, avoided sleeping with feet facing the door, the death position, kept shoes pointed inward to prevent spirits from walking in them, avoided leaving clothing turned inside out. Dreams weren't dismissed as random, they were messages. Villagers looked for patterns, symbols, or warnings in their dreams. A dream of running water meant change. A dream of fire signaled conflict. A dream of animals could predict illness or fortune depending on the species. The layout and structure of the home also mattered. Some homes had markings carved into beams or walls, crosses, circles, sun symbols, or knot patterns meant to confuse or repel unwanted forces. Windowsills might be lined with protective objects, especially during spiritually dangerous seasons like winter or major feasts. Even domestic chores were tied to superstition. Spinning or weaving on certain days was forbidden. Laundry left outside after dusk risked being touched by spirits. Knitting a garment while angry might stitch that emotion into the clothing. Breaking a dish was a sign that spiritual tension needed to be addressed. Children were watched more closely inside the home than anywhere else. Infants were considered spiritually delicate. They were never left unattended, not even for a moment. Cradles were placed carefully, avoiding drafts or dark corners where spirits might linger. Toys were sometimes given protective charms. A kiss on the forehead wasn't just affection, it was a blessing. Domestic animals shared in this protective web. Cats were guardians of the hearth. Though viewed with suspicion in later centuries, medieval villagers often saw them as protectors against spirits and pests. Dogs guarded the threshold. Chickens were believed to sense supernatural activity. Cows in the barn, watched carefully through the night, were considered spiritually linked to the household's fortune. Inside the home, villagers built a fortress of routine. Ordinary actions became rituals of protection. Nothing was truly mundane. Even hanging laundry or stirring a pot carried meaning, because every act either strengthened or weakened the home's defenses. To medieval villagers, magic wasn't something rare. It was woven into the very fabric of domestic life. Every corner of the home, hearth, doorway, bedroom, barn, had its own rules, dangers, and protective practices. These rituals gave families a sense of control in a world that was unpredictable, often harsh, and deeply mysterious. In the next part, we'll explore the seasonal calendar of superstitions, including the powerful beliefs tied to solstices, harvest festivals, winter nights, and the spiritually perilous days when villagers believed the boundaries between worlds were thinnest. To understand the beliefs of medieval villagers, you can't just look at their daily routines, you have to look at their year. Time itself was magical. The changing seasons didn't simply mark shifts in weather, they marked shifts in the spiritual world. Certain days were safe, others were dangerous, and some, those strange liminal days between seasons, were moments when villagers believed the veil between worlds grew thin. These weren't superstitions tacked onto daily life, they shaped daily life. They determined when to plant seeds, when to slaughter animals, when to hold weddings, when to avoid travel, and when to fear what lurked in the dark. Let's walk through that magical year. Winter was more than cold, it was spiritually heavy. The sun's retreat signaled vulnerability. Darkness was believed to bring out spirits, ghosts, and beings that roamed freely when human boundaries were weakest. The winter solstice, what many regions called midwinter, was especially powerful. Villagers believed this was the longest night, not only in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense as well. This was the time when ghosts were most active, the wild hunt was likely to ride across the sky, household spirits grew restless, fairies roamed roads and fields, protective charms were most necessary. That's why homes were lit with candles, evergreen branches were brought inside to trap or repel spirits, and fires were kept burning late into the night. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was a shield. The nights around midwinter were filled with rituals. Some families placed bread or grain outside as offerings to wandering spirits in hopes that appeasing them would protect the household. Others believed that spirits of ancestors visited during these nights, so they kept a seat open at the table or left a candle glowing in a window. Snow itself carried omens. The first snowfall of the year signaled prosperity or hardship, depending on its texture, timing, and the direction of the wind. A silent snowfall was considered peaceful, but snow accompanied by strange noises, howling wind, cracking ice, was a warning. As winter receded, villagers shifted from fear to anticipation. Spring meant renewal, but renewal didn't come easily. It needed to be coaxed, welcomed, and protected. Many villagers believed that the land spirit woke in spring, and if properly honored, it would bless the fields with fertility. Spring festivals were packed with rituals meant to encourage growth. People lit small fires and let livestock pass near them for good luck. They scattered herbs in fields, carried blessed candles, or walked the land's boundaries to protect it from misfortune. Spring was also believed to be a time when magical beings moved more freely. Fairies were thought to emerge from winter hiding and begin traveling again. The first flowers of spring were considered spiritually powerful, especially snowdrops, primroses, and violets. Picking the earliest blooms could bring luck or misfortune depending on the region. Rain in spring carried omens, too. The first rainfall was often collected in bowls and used for healing or protection. Dew gathered on certain mornings was believed to enhance beauty or cure ailments. And then there were the spring winds. Strong winds signaled strong harvests. Sudden warm gusts were considered warnings. Villagers paid attention to patterns, believing the wind was a messenger of the invisible world. Summer was the season of labor, but it was also the season of confidence. The sun held full strength. Spirits were believed to retreat into the shadows. Crops grew, livestock fattened. Human energy was at its peak. But that didn't mean magic disappeared. Midsummer, celebrated on the summer solstice, was one of the most magically charged days of the entire year. Fires were lit on hilltops to purify the land. People leapt through flames to ensure health. Herbs gathered on Midsummer Night were believed to be 10 times more potent than usual. St. John's wort, in particular, was thought to glow with spiritual power at this time. Midsummer Night was also famous for its sight between sights, when villagers believed you might catch glimpses of fairies, spirits, or ghostly processions if you wandered too near forests or old ruins. Many avoided certain places entirely on Midsummer Night, believing they were spiritually hot. Summer storms were another source of lore. Lightning was a powerful omen, sometimes interpreted as divine communication, sometimes as a sign of witchcraft. Thunder echoing in an unusual pattern could signal conflict or change, but the greatest summer superstition involved protection of the harvest. As crops matured, villagers feared forces, natural or supernatural, that might ruin them. To safeguard fields, people buried protective tokens in the soil, sang or whispered blessings while walking between rows, watched for strange shapes in the grain, reacted quickly to animals behaving unusually. If a field took on an eerie silence, villagers worried something unseen was wrong. Autumn was a time of wealth, harvest, abundance, full barns, but it was also the beginning of darkness's return. As days shortened, villagers grew cautious again. They believed the spiritual world strengthened as sunlight faded. The last sheaf of the harvest was treated with extraordinary reverence. In many villages, it represented the spirit of the field. Some called it the corn mother, others the harvest spirit. Families decorated it, kept it near the hearth, or mixed it into bread for luck. To discard it carelessly was unthinkable. But the most spiritually charged time of autumn was the season when people believed the dead walked more freely. This is where medieval beliefs intersected with older, pre-Christian traditions. In many regions, late autumn was seen as a time when ancestors returned, spirits roamed roads and fields, the boundary between life and death blurred, strange lights were seen over marshes, Animals behaved in ways that carried warnings. Villagers responded with ritual. Candles were lit to guide the dead home. Sacred objects were placed near doorways. Food was left out for wandering souls. Some avoided traveling after dusk altogether. Autumn also carried superstitions connected to preparation for winter. Drying herbs at the wrong time could ruin their power. Butchering animals required specific prayers. Storing grain incorrectly was believed to attract misfortune or even spiritual contamination. To medieval villagers, the year wasn't simply a cycle of seasons, it was a spiritual journey. Each period came with dangers and opportunities. Each transition demanded respect. Each festival reinforced the fragile balance between humans and the unseen forces around them. Their world wasn't divided between real and supernatural. Everything was part of the same reality. The seasons didn't just change temperature, they shifted the boundaries between worlds. In the next part, we'll explore the terrifying and fascinating supernatural creatures of medieval Europe, from demons and night spirits to monstrous omens believed to wander the land. If the medieval home was a fortress of protection, then the night was a frontier of fear. Darkness changed the landscape, shapes shifted, sounds sharpened, and what lived in the shadows, villagers believed, was not merely wildlife, but forces older, stranger, and far more dangerous. To us, night is inconvenience. To them, it was alive. Let's walk into that medieval darkness. The night was not empty. Once the sun vanished, the familiar world dissolved into something unpredictable. Candles did little. Hearth fires flickered. Every crack, creak, and gust of wind carried significance. Villagers believed that nighttime was when supernatural creatures roamed freely, unhindered by human boundaries or daylight's protection. Night wasn't just a time of reduced visibility. It was a time when the laws of the world loosened. One of the most feared nocturnal beings was the restless ghost. Medieval villagers believed that some souls did not pass peacefully into the afterlife. They lingered, out of anger, unfinished business, improper burial, or spiritual disruption. At night, these souls might tap on windows, call out names, walk roads or crossroads, knock over household objects, appear as shadows, lights, or cold breezes. Villagers responded by staying indoors, locking windows, burning protective herbs, or praying for the wandering soul to find peace. The line between a ghost and a spirit wasn't sharply defined. Some beings were simply believed to roam without purpose, like night walkers, faint human-like figures seen at distance, thought to be souls caught between worlds. As Christianity grew more authoritative during the medieval period, so did the idea of demons. Originally, many fears were rooted in pre-Christian folklore, but over time, the Church reframed many pagan beings as demonic forces. Demons were believed to lurk in abandoned ruins, near graveyards, at crossroads, in dense forests, around lonely moors and bogs. To medieval villagers, demons weren't abstract symbols of sin. They were literal entities that could harm the body, tempt the mind, or invade dreams. Sudden nightmares, sleep paralysis, or waking with a sense of dread were often attributed to demonic activity. And here enters one of the most feared beings of all. Many medieval cultures believed in a terrifying creature that pressed on the chest of sleepers, leaving them paralyzed and breathless. Today, we understand this as sleep paralysis, but to villagers it was the work of a night hag, a creature that crept into homes to sit on people's chests and steal their breath. People described the feeling of being watched, pressure on the chest, inability to speak or move, a dark figure in the room. To protect themselves, villagers slept with iron tools nearby, hung herbs over their beds, prayed before sleep, or avoided sleeping on their backs. The night hag had many names across regions, but the fear was universal. Fairies weren't always gentle creatures twirling in flowery meadows. Medieval fairies were unpredictable, powerful, and often dangerous, especially at night. Night was when fairies were believed to abduct travelers, mislead people into bogs, enchant those who wandered too far from home, ride wild winds, dance in meadows that no human should enter. If you heard music at night, faint, alluring, impossible to locate, you stayed indoors. If lights flickered in the distance, resembling lanterns, you did not follow them. These were believed to be fairy lights, or will-o'-the-wisps, spirits or fairies trying to lure wanderers to their doom. And if you walked too close to a fairy mound, grove, or sacred spring after sunset, you risked inviting misfortune into your life or home. Folklore is filled with creatures that blurred the line between human and animal. Among these, medieval villagers feared werewolves, not the dramatic creatures of modern film, but humans believed to transform into wolves through curses, sin, or magical influence. Wolf attacks in isolated regions fed these fears. Black dogs, enormous ghostly hounds with glowing eyes, said to appear near crossroads, graveyards, or lonely roads as omens of death. The wild hunt's hounds, spectral beasts belonging to the supernatural procession, believed to sweep across the sky. If villagers heard distant howls on stormy nights, they feared the hunt was near. And in forests, villagers believed in animals touched by magic, hares that were witches in disguise, ravens that carried messages from the other world, and deer that were sacred beings not to be harmed without consequence. Water was feared almost as much as fire was revered. Ponds, wells, and marshes were believed to contain sinister beings, water spirits that drowned those who came too close, merrows or water fae that lured the curious, bog lights that flickered to mislead travelers at night, river guardians that demanded respect and offerings. A nighttime walk near water was one of the most dangerous things a villager could do. If home was safety, then roads, especially at night, were liminal spaces where spiritual boundaries dissolved. Crossroads were especially feared. They were believed to be meeting points of spirits, places where ghosts lingered, boundaries where witches cast spells, pathways where demons wandered, travelers prayed before passing a crossroads at night. Some tossed coins or bread as payment to whatever forces lurked there. No medieval fear was more dramatic or more widespread than the wild hunt. On stormy nights, when wind roared and clouds raced across the moon, villagers believed a spectral host rode across the sky, horses galloping, hounds howling, torches blazing, ghostly figures in pursuit of souls. The wild hunt was not a mythic story. It was a genuine terror. If someone heard strange rushing sounds above them, they bolted inside. Doors were barred, fires stoked, silence kept. Anyone caught outdoors during the hunt risked being swept away, cursed, or marked for death. Night creatures weren't just stories. They gave shape to real dangers. Wolves, thieves, freezing temperatures, getting lost, real illnesses, unexplained death. The supernatural explanation offered meaning, structure, and a sense of control. Villagers didn't believe in monsters because they lacked intelligence. They believed because these stories helped them survive. The night was unpredictable. The mind filled the darkness with meaning, and those meanings guided behavior, kept people close to home, and taught caution in a world where the edges were always dangerous. In the next part, we'll explore omens, divination, and medieval forms of predicting fate. How villagers sought to understand not just the unseen world, but the future itself. To medieval villagers, the world wasn't simply something to endure, it was something to interpret. Life was filled with questions that couldn't be answered through reason alone. Would the harvest be good? Would a child survive winter? Would a marriage be successful? Would illness strike? Would storms destroy crops? In a world without scientific forecasting, divination wasn't a mystical hobby. It was a practical tool for navigating uncertainty. Villagers didn't believe the future was fixed, but they believed it left clues, scattered like breadcrumbs across the landscape of daily life. Their task was to find them. Let's step into that mindset, into a world where the future was a puzzle the universe wanted people to solve. For medieval villagers, everyday occurrences could reveal the shape of things to come. The natural world wasn't random. It was a messenger. A sudden wind gust might warn of conflict. A candle that flickered strangely might signal a visitor. A cup falling off a table without being touched could mean a quarrel approaching. Animals especially acted as messengers of fate. Cats were revered and feared depending on their behavior. If a cat cleaned its face near the door, it meant visitors were coming. If it refused food for no reason, illness was feared. Crows and ravens were famously ominous. If one perched near a home, villagers believed death might follow. Birds flying unusually low meant storms. If a rooster crowed at the wrong hour, it was a spiritual disturbance. If bees swarmed suddenly, it foretold financial change, good or bad depending on the region. These interpretations weren't arbitrary. They were old wisdom, collected over generations of observation. In a world without reliable weather prediction, omens filled the gap. The sky was one of the most powerful sources of divination. Medieval people were attentive to the color of clouds, the shape of the moon, the path of the sun, halos around celestial bodies, sudden changes in wind. An eclipse was terrifying and awe-inspiring. Villagers believed the sun and moon were sending warnings to humanity. Some thought eclipses foretold the fall of kings, the outbreak of war or plague. Comets were feared even more. They were believed to be supernatural arrows shot across the heavens, omens of disaster or divine displeasure. When a bright comet appeared, villages often turned to prayer, fasting, or ritual in hopes of averting whatever doom it portended. Lightning strikes were also symbolic. If lightning hit a tree near a home, it meant the household needed spiritual cleansing. If it struck a barn, villagers feared a curse or imbalance in the community. Beyond observing nature, villagers practiced simple forms of divination using everyday tools. One of the most common was casting lots, tossing small objects like stones, bones, or sticks to see how they landed. The shapes they formed were believed to carry meaning. A circle suggested harmony. A crooked line warned of conflict. An unexpected cluster indicated a change in fortune. Another method was water divination. Villagers dropped objects into bowls or wells and observed the ripples, the sinking speed, the direction of movement. A smooth, quick sink meant stability. A slow, wobbling descent suggested uncertainty. If the water rejected the object, causing it to float unexpectedly, villagers believed spiritual forces were resisting the question being asked. Fire divination was equally common. People watched how flames behaved when asking a question. A tall flame meant yes. A wavering flame meant hesitation. A sudden crackle meant danger. Fire, being the heart of the home, was treated as a spiritual communicator. Dreams were one of the most significant sources of divination. Medieval villagers believed dreams were portals, places where the soul glimpsed truths hidden from waking life. A dream of running water meant change or emotional shifts. A dream of fire foretold conflict or passion. Dreaming of losing teeth was widely feared as an omen of death. Animals appearing in dreams carried symbolic weight. A wolf meant betrayal. A snake meant hidden danger. A dog meant loyalty being tested. Dream books circulated among clergy and educated people, but dream interpretation was also deeply rooted in folk knowledge. Mothers taught their daughters what dreams meant. Elders explained patterns they had observed over decades. Dreams were not dismissed as imagination. They were warnings, advice, or spiritual commentary. The body was believed to react to future events. Sudden twitching of the eye, itching of the hand, or chills for no reason were interpreted as subtle signs of fate. A right-hand itch meant money coming. A left-hand itch meant money leaving. A ringing ear meant someone speaking about you. A sudden shiver meant unseen forces walking nearby. Villagers didn't view their bodies as separate from the world. They saw them as instruments tuned to spiritual vibrations. Certain times of year were believed to heighten prophetic ability. These were moments when the veil between worlds thinned. Midwinter, midsummer, harvest time, Halloween-like autumn festivals, the 12 days of Christmas. During these periods, villagers performed rituals to glimpse the future. Some slept with special herbs under their pillows. Some stared into mirrors or water surfaces to see visions. Others listened to the wind, believing it carried whispers from the other side. Young unmarried women performed love divination, throwing shoes over doors, peeling apples in long spirals, or gazing into candlelight while asking who their future husband might be. These rituals were playful but deeply meaningful, offering hope in a world where marriage shaped survival. It's important to remember that the church discouraged many forms of divination, but villagers didn't see a sharp line between religious and pagan. Many combined both. A person might light a candle to a saint and read omens in the same evening. Clerical forms of divination involved prayer, fasting, consulting saints' relics, reading scripture for guidance. Folk divination involved nature, dreams, objects, fire and water, animals, the body. Together, these practices created a world view where the future wasn't a mystery, it was a conversation. At its core, divination wasn't about controlling the future, it was about preparing for it. Villagers lived on the edge of survival. They needed every bit of guidance they believed the world offered. Divination helped them make decisions, reduce fear, and feel connected to the rhythms that shaped their existence. The future wasn't unknowable, it was constantly speaking. Villagers only had to listen. In the next part, we'll explore community rituals, public magic, and the collective beliefs that shaped village identity, revealing how entire communities worked together to maintain spiritual balance. Medieval villagers didn't live as isolated individuals. They lived as part of a tightly connected whole, and their beliefs were shaped by that shared existence. To understand their world view, you have to imagine an entire village moving as one, breathing together, worrying together, celebrating together. Magic wasn't just something practiced privately behind closed doors. It was a collective experience woven into every gathering, every feast, every shared task, and every season of the year. The community was a living organism, and keeping it spiritually balanced was everyone's responsibility. Villagers believed that a place had its own spirit, a kind of personality shaped by the land, the people, and the history of generations who came before. When one family suffered, the village felt it. When one household prospered, it was seen as a sign that the community as a whole was in good standing with the unseen world. Harmony wasn't only social, it was spiritual. If that harmony was disturbed, the entire settlement could become vulnerable. This belief was most visible in the rituals that marked the changing of seasons. Before planting began, villagers joined together to bless the fields. The priest walked the village boundaries, sprinkling holy water, while the people followed behind, chanting prayers or old charms passed down by their elders. Children were encouraged to shout or strike sticks against the earth, waking it from its winter slumber. These weren't quaint traditions to them. They were acts of defense, sealing the land against harmful forces that might disrupt the harvest. On feast days, the entire village participated in rituals that blended Christianity with older, earth-centered practices. Easter eggs weren't just symbols of rebirth. Pieces of their shells were scattered in fields to encourage growth. On midsummer night, bonfires roared across hilltops. Villagers leapt through flames to ensure health, walked their livestock through smoke to protect them from disease, and burned herbs believed to reach their peak power under the solstice moon. These communal fires weren't simply celebrations, they were spiritual armor. Harvest time was especially important. When the final sheaf of grain was cut, it wasn't treated as mere vegetation. It was believed to contain the essence or spirit of the field itself. Some villages wove this sheaf into a figure and placed it near the hearth to safeguard the home. Others saved it until the next planting season, treating it as a symbol of continuity and a promise of future abundance. The act of saving that last sheaf bonded the community to the land in a ritual cycle that was both practical and sacred. Communal rituals also emerged during moments of danger. When illness spread through a village, when fevers rose suddenly or children died unexpectedly, the entire community mobilized. People walked through the streets, carrying candles, believing the light would chase away the spirit of sickness. Herbs were burned to purify the air. Bells rang throughout the village, creating a wall of sound meant to drive away unseen forces. These rituals were intense, urgent, and deeply emotional, reflecting the fear of a world where disease could strike without warning. And it wasn't only illness that drew communal action. Violent storms, flooding rivers, or a series of uncanny events could prompt group rituals as well. Villagers gathered on hilltops to call for divine protection, or they stood at the edges of their fields chanting prayers into the wind. The natural world was powerful, and the combined voices of the community were believed to be even more powerful. Sometimes the community needed to cleanse itself. After repeated misfortunes, a failed harvest, a cluster of deaths, or a streak of sickness, villagers believed the entire place had absorbed negative energy. Homes were scrubbed from floor to rafters. Fires were extinguished and rekindled from a single pure flame. Wells were blessed. Streets were smoked with herbs. These acts weren't symbolic. They were ways of resetting the spiritual balance of the village, like clearing a sickness from the bones of a community. Magic even influenced justice. When harm struck repeatedly, suspicion often turned toward individuals believed to be out of harmony with the village, people who quarreled, isolated themselves, or carried reputations of envy. Villagers didn't rely solely on logical reasoning. They observed patterns of misfortune, watched how animals reacted around certain people, and examined how individuals behaved during ritual moments. If someone seemed spiritually out of balance, the community often interpreted this as a sign of harmful magic. Trials weren't always violent or dramatic, but they were deeply charged with spiritual significance. Rituals were used to seek the truth, touching sacred objects, standing before holy symbols, or speaking certain phrases that villagers believed would reveal guilt or innocence. Charms weren't just kept in personal pockets or hung inside individual homes, they were shared. Songs used for blessing crops were sung by entire groups. Children learned protective rhymes. Doors across the village bore similar carved symbols. During seasonal changes, bonfires lit across the region created a network of protective light believed to connect one settlement to the next. Even the way villagers honored their dead carried communal weight. During certain times of the year, especially in late autumn, people believed their ancestors walked among them. Rather than fearing this, they welcomed it. Families placed candles in windows, left food on tables, or spoke softly into the night to honor the spirits of those who came before. This wasn't a private act. It was a shared conviction that the living and the dead were bound together. A village that honored its ancestors was believed to be protected by them. Every ritual, every feast, every collective act strengthened the spiritual shield around the community. Isolation was dangerous. Disunity threatened the balance between the seen and unseen worlds. But when villagers acted together, they believed they could influence fate itself. Unity wasn't just social solidarity. It was the most powerful magic they possessed. To understand why medieval villagers believed so deeply in magic, superstition, and unseen forces, you have to imagine living in a world where almost nothing was certain. Weather could destroy food for an entire year. A simple illness could take a life overnight. Forests stretched endlessly. Nights were genuinely dark. Silence was never empty. It was filled with possibilities. In that world, magic was not escapism. It was a framework that made life understandable. Every belief, every ritual, every charm was rooted in the same underlying truth. People needed meaning. They needed reasons for suffering, explanations for fortune, and tools for navigating fear. Magic filled that gap. It allowed medieval villagers to interpret a world that often felt overwhelming. And because these beliefs were shared, not isolated in individuals, they became part of the culture's psychological backbone. When something went wrong, superstition offered structure. It pointed to causes, whether envy from a neighbor, a restless spirit, or imbalance in the natural world. This didn't make villagers irrational, it made them resilient. Belief created a sense of control, a way to respond, even when reality offered no clear answers. If a cow died suddenly, villagers didn't accept despair. They examined signs, consulted a healer, performed a counter-charm, and tried again. Action replaced helplessness. Superstition also gave people a way to manage fear. In a world full of wolves, bandits, famine, and disease, fear could easily take over. But rituals, lighting candles, scattering herbs, blessing seeds, knocking on wood, helped turn fear into something functional. These small acts transformed the unknown into something that could be named, handled, and guarded against. Even if a ritual had no physical effect, it had an emotional one. It helped people breathe. Folk magic also held communities together. Shared beliefs created shared solutions. When a storm threatened crops, villagers gathered on hilltops together. When disease came, they marched with candles together. When misfortune struck, they talked openly about omens, signs, and spirits until they found a path forward. These rituals made people feel less alone. They made danger feel communal rather than isolating, a burden shared by many instead of carried by one. Psychologically, medieval magic was a deeply human response to powerlessness. Today, we rely on science to explain the world, but medieval villagers had no such certainty. Their explanations came from patterns they saw in nature and from stories passed down through generations. These stories didn't need to be factually correct. They simply needed to offer comfort, direction, and a sense of belonging. And they did. Magic also connected villagers to the land in intimate ways. The earth wasn't just soil, it was alive. Forests had personalities, wells had guardians, hills held memories. By treating nature as something conscious, villagers formed a reciprocal relationship with their environment. They didn't see themselves as separate from nature, but deeply intertwined with it. This worldview created respect, responsibility, and an unspoken understanding that humans lived within a larger, older system. There was also the emotional dimension. Grief, love, jealousy, fear, and hope all found expression through magical thinking. A charm for love wasn't just a superstition, it was a way to articulate longing. A protective amulet for a child wasn't a trinket. It was a parent's desperate expression of love and fear interwoven. A ritual performed for the dead wasn't just symbolic, it was a way to manage sorrow and maintain connection. Superstition allowed people to speak the language of their own emotions through the world around them. Magic also shaped identity. Villagers knew who they were based on their rituals, their shared knowledge, and their collective responses to the unseen. Their beliefs weren't static. They evolved with every generation, absorbing Christian elements, old pagan customs, regional variations, and practical knowledge about how the world worked. This evolving blend created a culture that was neither purely pagan nor purely Christian, but something uniquely medieval, a tapestry woven from centuries of lived experience. And importantly, medieval villagers didn't view themselves as superstitious. They believed they were behaving rationally in a world filled with spiritual and physical threats. To them, charms, omens, and rituals weren't magical. They were practical. Just as someone today might trust a doctor, a medieval villager trusted signs in nature, advice from a wise woman, or a charm inherited from grandparents. These were their sources of authority. Even when beliefs caused fear, fear of witches, fear of spirits, fear of curses, those fears were rooted in genuine concerns about survival and community safety. Suspicion wasn't mindless. It emerged after patterns of misfortune, during times of stress, or in the aftermath of tragedies. Belief shaped behavior, and behavior shaped belief. What's remarkable is how effectively these systems worked within their world. Even if the supernatural explanations weren't correct, the rituals often reinforced real-world solutions, checking on neighbors, strengthening social ties, tending to the land, marking boundaries, sharing resources, protecting vulnerable members of the community, and maintaining order. Magic wasn't a distraction from daily life. It was daily life. It guided when to plant, when to marry, when to travel, and how to respond to crisis. It filled the spaces where knowledge was incomplete. It soothed emotional wounds. It strengthened community bonds. It allowed people to feel safer in a world that was anything but safe. And, as we look back from a modern perspective, it becomes clear that these beliefs weren't foolish or primitive. They were deeply human. They were creative, adaptive, and rooted in an attempt to understand a universe that felt vast and unpredictable. Every ritual, every charm, every superstition was an act of hope. Medieval villagers weren't living in ignorance. They were living with meaning. And that meaning gave them resilience. It gave them identity. It gave them courage. In a world where danger was constant and explanations were scarce, belief was their greatest tool. Magic was their map. Superstition was their compass. And together, these practices shaped the rhythm of medieval life in ways that echo quietly in our own traditions even today.